Rowe. I'm a independent consultant that worked on the overall reference document and then also the note on working in context of fragility. I think 2 points to start. First is that because the reference document kind of deals relatively straightforwardly with the sort of more traditional shock responsive approach in fragile and conflict-affected countries, then for this note, I kind of wanted to focus a bit more on the more kind of broader nexus approach. So thinking perhaps slightly less about a very traditional shock response, you know, scaling up, scaling down, etc., in response to an acute crisis, but thinking a little bit more broadly as well about how to leverage the complementarities, how to bring together those different actors in a nexus approach, the humanitarian, social protection, political and security actors, and leverage the complementarities, not always necessarily for an acute shock response, but also for things like the system building agenda. So that's one thing. The other thing to say is that obviously whilst this note draws on the existing literature, I also did... Whilst this note draws on the existing literature, I also did quite a number of interviews to inform the note. I think I spoke with about 18 or 20 people I think about 2/3 of them were in field offices, so relatively frontline practitioners, and then about 1/3 in headquarters. And that's from humanitarian, social protection, mainly donor agencies or UN agencies. And so for the purposes of this note, what am I doing? Yes. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the sort of more promising practices that came out from those discussions. So the first thing to say is, what is context of fragility? There's obviously lots of different definitions, and everybody has different lists of fragile countries and contexts. For the purposes of this note, I used the capacity, legitimacy, security model, which is used in the EU staff handbook on operating in context of fragility and conflict. I think the key point to note is that the countries over here, this picture is taken from 2010, so it's quite old, but the key point to note is that many countries, many fragile countries, have kind of challenges across all of those dimensions: capacity, legitimacy and security, but obviously a few are more pronounced in just one or two of the areas. Okay, so just going straight into the kind of how would you start to approach this topic in a very practical way? I thought it might be helpful to organise the thinking and the initial assessments around these 5 dimensions. And also to say that this framework applies not only to the social protection context, but also to humanitarian actors, to state and to non-state. So it's kind of understanding the landscape across all of those dimensions, across social protection, humanitarian, state and non-state. Stakeholders and institutions also includes things like the policy framework, who the key actors are, what their capacities are, what their commitment is, etc. Data and information systems refers to the data that the social protection programs are based on and data that humanitarian programs are based on. And the information systems that organise that data. Program design is things, what programs exist, the objectives of those programs, the eligibility criteria, etc. And then the delivery systems is really looking at the nuts and bolts. How are programs, whether it's social protection or humanitarian, how are they sort of physically delivered on the ground in terms of if it's a cash transfer, the payment providers and that sort of thing. And then the finance architecture. There were 6 principles. I've been asked to keep this a little bit short, so I won't go through all of them, but I'll just pick a few. The do no harm principle, obviously that applies in all fragile contexts in any case. From a social protection point of view, we're particularly looking at the issues around not damaging the underlying social protection system, no matter how nascent that is, making sure that you're not kind of overloading the system, that you're not assuming that, yes, everything should be shock responsive through the social protection system. It also includes things like making sure that beneficiaries are not worse off through receiving support through a social protection oriented response than they would have been through just a standalone, regular humanitarian response, and also things like conflict sensitivity, which was mentioned earlier. I think the next one I'll just mention is the flexibility and simplicity principle. Obviously, that's important anyway in a fragile and conflict-affected context. You need to be relatively simple. Programs need to be flexible to respond. But I think the key point from a social protection perspective is, first of all, that the more simple a design is, then potentially the more scalable it is over the longer term. It's much easier to scale up when you've got pretty simple targeting and payment mechanisms, etc. And also, simplicity also helps to navigate the trade-offs that are implicit in bringing together these two agendas. I think in theory it should be a lot clearer to make decisions about what trade-offs you're happy to make in terms of transfer values, targeting approaches, etc. if you're very, very clear and simple about what your objectives are from the beginning and the design of the programme. Okay, so using that framework that I presented, in terms of the stakeholders and institutions, this is, as I say, some of the kind of key practices that came out particularly from the interviews. Building strategic partnerships in advance, that we've already mentioned, that everybody talks about it and it's very difficult to do. I think one point that came out is around the need to invest, to not just assume that people can do this as part of their regular day-to-day work, but to, in some countries, donors had actually paid for a full-time staff member to simply just kickstart the process through doing lots and lots of coordination and relationship building and, get to know you meetings, etc. So I think that came out as particularly important. And also not just social protection and humanitarian, but also the political actors, the security actors, local government, as we've mentioned, NGOs. This is the old version of the presentation, never mind. The next point I will mention is being flexible with policy instruments. So I think that came out from Yemen in particular, where there is a high level political will to take action, then there can be sort of creativity, flexibility in the interpretation of internal policies, in the interpretation of internal financing regulations, if you have that kind of quite high level commitment. Factoring in the different procedures and timelines, I think one of the key points is that whilst it's relatively simple to do joint analysis, joint context analysis and agree what the joint priorities are, that's a kind of relatively simple process. What seemed to be clear is that moving beyond that in terms of, okay, so if these are our joint priorities, what does that mean for programming, and actually moving that forward is extremely difficult because of different agencies' decision-making procedures, timelines, etc. So factoring those in, and then related to that, very strong leadership and a clarity of process. So having one agency that really drives it forward and is very, very clear at each stage of this process, this is what we expect to be an outcome. And partnering on low-risk actions to build trust. There were things like government capacity building, etc., that were mentioned. Data and information systems, I guess there's nothing hugely new here. It's already covered, but in advance, the more you can do in advance with strengthening these data systems that underpin the programs. A lot of the evidence is saying it's very, very difficult to do sensible programming when we just don't have the information, when the data systems just don't provide what we need. Developing assessments that serve humanitarian actors and jointly developing scale-up triggers. Program design. So yeah, I mentioned about the starting point. Everybody was very clear is to have a joint context analysis and jointly agree your priorities. But I think a key part of that was also some kind of political economy analysis, not necessarily a huge 3-4 month multi-stakeholder exercise, but even something quick and dirty to get a sense of what the political economy might be around a more nexus type approach. Considering social cohesion approaches, I would say, I think that came out clearly in terms of the need to always have one eye on making sure that your approaches are transparent, are acceptable, are sort of based on community norms and what would be accepted in the community, and sort of where you can building that into your program design. Very complicated, opaque targeting systems are going to potentially foster social tensions. Compromise and trade-offs with things like transfer values are the obvious, and the targeting approaches and eligibility criteria are the two obvious ones, but kind of being prepared from the outset that everybody has to compromise in this if you want to bring these two agendas together. Recognising historical barriers to access was really about saying that even in a post-conflict environment where government is taking on an agenda for expanding social protection in a very fragile situation, there will always be groups of people that are excluded from service delivery for historical, political reasons. And this came out, there are a couple of countries, one in Iraq in particular, where they were saying we will always, not always, but for the foreseeable future need standalone humanitarian support for these groups of people because they are, for whatever reason, associated with ISIS or thought to be associated with ISIS. And then quick wins for building confidence, etc. And quick wins can be things like capacity building, handing over some small parts of implementation to government relatively early on. Delivery systems, I'll just say, well, it's kind of obvious, but making sure that your nuts and bolts of your delivery, your targeting system, your cash transfer, your actual delivery system can operate during a crisis so that if there's a flood, you know, the payment system still continues to operate. If you've got mobile populations, they can still continue to receive funds. One really interesting point that came out in so many different contexts was often these processes are quite politically fraught and can get quite bogged down in institutional mandates and etc. And people were saying sometimes you can kind of sidestep all that by just focusing initially on something very relatively simple and tangible and concrete, like harmonising beneficiary lists or developing an MIS system or something that people can get stuck into, see results relatively quickly, and it sort of bypasses the political dimensions, and then you can deal with those when relationships have been built a bit more and trust is there. And then innovate for monitoring and evaluation, things like third-party monitoring, electronic using social media platforms, WhatsApp, etc. for monitoring programs was quite an interesting approach that was being taken in some of the more insecure contexts. And then financing instruments, just that crises can generate additional financing, which offers a window not only for new financing, but also for new kind of policy approaches. Pooled funds may sort of spread the risk in particularly contentious, challenging contexts, and layering instruments to cover different sized risks. How much time have I got?
I think you have about a minute.
Oh no, okay. I forgot to ask for a 5-minute warning.
Yes, I should have. I'm
sorry.
First, you see.
Sorry. Okay, so I'll just skip. What I'll do.
If you can, a couple of minutes.
Okay. So basically in the note, there's different sort of promising practices that came out from different kinds of contexts. Things like, we've talked about it, the existing social protection, the state of the existing social protection will influence the nature of the options available at the stage of the crisis. I'll just say something about the fragility. Here we go. So these were just a few points that came out from if you're working in a context where there's the main challenge is a real strong government capacity gap, or if it's legitimacy or security. So working through government systems, I think it was interesting that there's some work saying that it's not just a binary choice of working with national government or not working. There's many different ways that you can engage government, whether it's local government level, whether it's just one unit within the government. It doesn't need to be that the government is kind of managing the whole programme. They can be, I think maybe Nupur or somebody mentioned it, different different responsibilities that government can take on, or different ways of working with them. But also this really came out strongly from the humanitarian people of agreeing red lines, that, you know, that we do have to be clear that sometimes it is necessary to say, actually, there is no circumstances that we can work with this government. And then related to that is sort of thinking about working or agreeing common advocacy messages, so engaging via political actors or EUD development actors, and agreeing common advocacy messages like preserving, you know, the need to preserve humanitarian space, the need for durable solutions, so that you can still get those humanitarian messages across to government. The legitimacy point, we talk a lot about social protection, building the social contract, and, you know, there's different evidence around that, but I think what's very clear from the evidence is that the bigger risk is that a badly implemented social protection program can really undermine trust in the state, more than the kind of opposite, that you might be building trust. And the key lesson around that is that it seems to be people's experiences on the ground, their frontline experience of the service, that can really do the most damage in terms of making people lose trust in the program implementers or in the state. So culturally appropriate, transparent and simple programming that people can see, you know, it makes sense to them why one household is receiving support and one household isn't. And that delivers, if you say you're going to deliver a certain benefit at a certain time, that the program delivers what it says it will deliver. And then related to that, in the actual kind of frontline service delivery, particularly around things like complaints and redress, the accountability systems, making sure that those work and they are effective, so people can complain and their complaints are dealt with appropriately, and a sort of good, strong program communication system came out. And also investing in social protection for its own sake, not purely as a kind of government legitimacy. And then security, okay, I think that's all pretty. Yeah, okay, fair enough. That was it anyway.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And we've got time for one or two questions. This is Fragility, and a lot of us are working in areas where, you know, monitoring and evaluation is difficult. And I'm thinking of places like, you know, Northern Darfur, where perhaps telecommunications are not the best, and security means that we don't have access. So, you know, if you have any questions or how you would apply this in a particular context of fragility, or, you know, a conflict-affected context, please, you know, put it forward. Otherwise, we can move straight on to the next presentation in the interests of time, if there's nothing burning. Yes?
I don't want to take too much time, sorry. But I'm just trying to throw something out there. We may not discuss it now, but
Yes.
could. From the experience that we have, I'm looking at Saman because I'm talking about his country where he is right now, Myanmar. The experience that, and what I've understood from the way UNICEF has worked on social protection and expanding an existing program into a conflict-affected area, is one of the big learning for me there was about this whole coordination business that we talk about. Whereas in normal kind of humanitarian context, it's about coordinating between DRM ministry and social protection and other ministries. I think in Myanmar what worked very well was not to have that coordination, right? To use one department against the other in a way to expand. So I was wondering whether it came out in any of your...
No, but it sounds interesting. Say, what do you mean, use one?
No, I think in talking about complexity in Myanmar can be a very long conversation. But I think in terms of even understanding, first of all, that there is no one government. So you spoke about, for example, agreeing on red lines. There are red lines even within the government, who you can work with in the government, who you probably can't work with in the government, or with what somebody might be proposing, what somebody else in the government might not be proposing. At a basic level in Myanmar, at the national level, you have a civilian side of the government and basically a military side of the government.
Yeah.
So the cash transfer program that we are supporting as UNICEF, leading a group of 5 agencies, the World Bank, WFP, Save the Children, and IRC, is supporting the Department of Social Welfare, which is one of the more progressive elements in the civilian side, probably the most progressive element in the civilian side of the government, to expand their maternal and child cash transfer program, which is a universal program, to all parts of Rakhine State. Given the sensitivity, discrimination, and so forth, that becomes a very important initiative, actually, a openly stated program to support all pregnant women and kids up to the age of 2 across Rakhine State from all communities. And this is, of course, not considering those who emigrated to Bangladesh after the conflict and so forth. But for those remaining, that becomes a very important instrument to promote social cohesion and to I think I think Usha was talking about how people felt that the government cares. It's not about necessarily the value and so forth, but the whole issue around actually us even engaging in that effort meant doing a whole risk mapping, understanding red lines, and there are red lines even not even saying we will or we won't work with the government, but what aspects can we work with in terms of if the government uses pushes to use lists coming from the state government, we can't work with that. If there's open registration, we can work with that. How do we support that, etc., etc. So yeah, there's different variations and layers, I think, of even understanding what red lines are and so forth, and how we can go about supporting that and actually shaping that.
So thank you very much for sharing that innovative example of how each context is very different and complex, and how one needs to be innovative and understand the circumstance to adapt. Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to move on to our next. Thank you very much for that. That was very good. Thank you.